Hello there, it's Paul Fitzgerald here, and thanks so much for joining me today. Now, most likely you are here because you saw an ad that possibly made you sit up and think, maybe I do need to know some more about this stuff. Now, just to recap, it was a tale of two doctors, Dr. Bill and Dr. Harry. Both lived in the same town, went to med school together, and opened practices in the same area. They both were married. Each had two beautiful children. They both drove a nice car, had a successful practice and a good income. Life was good. One day, though, something happened that changed Dr. Bill's life forever. Dr. Bill was a victim of a cyber attack. He arrived at his practice one morning to find a message on the computer telling him to pay $3,000 in bitcoins so he could get his data back. Now, Dr. Bill didn't know what to do, so he called his IT guy, who said, "No worries, I'll load up the backup and you'll be back in business in no time." Now, unfortunately, the IT guy had not checked that the backup worked, so all the patient information was lost. What happened next was that Dr. Bill had to report a data breach to the Privacy Commission, to AHPRA, and to the Digital Health Authority. He then had to notify all of his patients that they had possibly, or in this case probably, been breached. Half of these patients then left the practice because they no longer felt Dr. Bill could be trusted with their personal information. And hundreds of these patients also joined a class action suing Dr. Bill for negligence. Neither Dr. Bill's medical indemnity insurance nor his other practice insurances covered him for the damages, which were about $350 per patient, or for the fine imposed by the Privacy Commissioner, which can be up to $1.8 million. Dr. Bill's staff had to be laid off, he had to close the practice, and eventually he had to sell the family home and his nice car to avoid bankruptcy. Now, during this avoidable event, Dr. Harry also had an attempt by criminals to ransom his practice. But Dr. Harry had learned a few simple strategies, and so he knew how to prevent this sort of disaster from happening. So which doctor are you? Are you a Dr. Bill or a Dr. Harry? My guess is that you're probably very much a Dr. Harry. But you sure as heck don't want to be like Dr. Bill. The question is, do you know how to avoid being Dr. Bill? Today we're going to be talking about how you can reduce the risk of losing everything you have worked for in your practice. I'll be showing you how you can act now to minimise the risk of a cyber breach that could cost you millions of dollars in fines and damages. And I'll also teach you how to put some processes in place to simplify the way you run your business. Now, you may be thinking this only applies to doctors, but if you run any sort of healthcare business, these lessons apply to you. So let me ask you a question. What if you fully understood your risk of a cyber privacy breach? What if you had a simple planning process in place to help minimise any risk? And what if you had the peace of mind that if the worst happened, you and your practice would survive? Would that let you sleep better at night? Perhaps reduce your risk of burnout? Knowing that by managing these things proactively, you're building a legacy and a valuable, saleable asset for your long-term future. Or would you love to be comfortable in the knowledge that you took all possible precautions to stop a cyber or privacy breach from sinking your practice? Well, guess what? If that has your attention, you're absolutely in the right place. Now let's just quickly cover some housekeeping. This session is going to be for you if you're a practice owner who understands that without the right strategy in place, you are only ever 30 seconds away from disaster. If you're looking for a simple way to put some basic security practices in place. And if you want to learn how to avoid the huge penalties if you have a privacy breach. Or if you simply want to be able to sleep at night, knowing that you really are a Dr. Harry and not a Dr. Bill. Now, if that's you, as I said, you're in the right place. Now, conversely, this is not for you if you're doing just fine. If you're fully aware of the risk of a cyber breach and have taken actions to reduce this risk. And if you've got no security issues in your practice, it's not for you. And it's certainly not for you if you don't want to learn something new or want to change the way you do things. Now, if that is you, sign off now and I wish you the best of luck. So why am I doing this? Well, over the years, I've come to discover that practices that run like clockwork have one thing in common, and that's a system. And more than that, it's a system that ties together the people and the processes and the technology. So I'm looking for some like-minded individuals who want to learn how to avoid the most common pitfalls in a practice. Things like ignoring the reality of cyber criminals. They really are out there. Failing to manage their risk by planning ahead. And failing to put basic security in place. Now, I don't know if that's you yet, but we'll see. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to show you how to de-risk your practice in 3 ways. The first thing I'll do is teach you how to stop people stealing your records. Then I'll talk to you about how to reduce your risk by introducing planning into your practice. And the third thing I'll do is I'll show you 5 simple practices you can implement today to protect your practice and your livelihood. And you'll notice as we go through that these 3 concepts are all linked together. So by following these suggestions, you'll be able to have a practice that is much less likely to have a privacy breach. You'll know exactly what to do in the unlikely event of a breach, and you'll fully understand your risk profile and how to manage the things that you can avoid and insure for those that you can't. So why listen to me? Well, I've worked in healthcare across multiple care settings for over 30 years. I started life as a pharmaceutical rep, calling on doctors and pharmacies, then specialists and hospitals. And during this time, I got a first-hand look at how practices run, the good, the bad, and in some cases, the downright ugly. I also worked with medical device companies, and then for the last 20-odd years with healthcare IT companies. I've also run multinational companies as well as startups, all in the healthcare market. I was a senior executive in several of these, and then left to work as a consultant to startups. And that means that I've come across and learned how to fix most of the problems that you face on a day-to-day basis. I've worked with many companies to help them align their values with how they work. And I've also restructured teams to get optimum performance, as well as creating several profitable businesses across the region. I'm a cyber and privacy risk expert, especially regarding healthcare. Now, I've seen and experienced some real shockers when it comes to security, or what sometimes passes for security. And finally, I've been conducting risk assessments for medical practices and healthcare technology companies for several years. I can almost guarantee that you will have vulnerabilities. The good news is that most of these, whilst potentially very serious, are relatively simple to fix. Now, just to allay any fears you may have about a hard sell coming up, there is nothing for sale here today. You can't buy anything from me here. But if you do stay until the end, then I have a gift for you worth $495 that will allow you to dramatically change the way you view your practice, and also a way to have all your questions answered for free. So let's move on then. Are you doing things the hard way? Have you no idea of your risk profile or how to manage it? Have you ever sat down and thought about risk in your business? Now, I'm sure you have locks on the doors, but do your staff have strong passwords on their computers? Passwords that are frequently changed? Or does your practice, like some I've come across, share login details? Have you outsourced your IT support and have no way of controlling security? Now, if you have handed off security and privacy of your technology to a third party, you're certainly not alone. But have you established a strong, binding contract with that organisation to ensure that if something does go wrong, you both know where you stand? Do you have consequential damages clauses? Do you know what will happen if that person breaches your patient's privacy? Do you know how to add security practices to your clinic? As I mentioned earlier, small things can be very dangerous to the security of your patient data, but most are fairly easy to fix, with a bit of know-how and a focus on the end game. And you have no advice on how to create a security culture with your staff in your practice. Now, there are thousands of small business consultants out there, but how many actually understand healthcare? Now, it doesn't have to be this way. But first, you do need to understand that you're running a business here, not just a practice. You became a health professional to help people lead healthier lives, presumably. You got into business to build a team to help even more people be healthy. But now you discover that it's not good enough to be a great clinician. You also have to become a successful business person and a security expert as well. And these are whole new skill sets they didn't teach you in med school. But where do you go? Do you go back to uni and do a 4-year degree in business? 2 years to get an MBA? Neither of which will have any specifics about running a medical practice. You could do as someone who's been there before. As Dr. Corey Schuller points out, it doesn't matter how smart a doctor is. If they can't keep the lights on, they can't help anyone. So let me tell you about an easier way. You can reduce the risk of staff undermining your practice, either on purpose or accidentally. You can put a system in place that manages technology, processes and people meaning a well-run practice that is much better prepared to avoid the almost inevitable hackers and criminals who are looking for easy pickings. And all of this leads to great patient loyalty because your patients will trust you and your staff to look after their private information. And you can easily understand your risk universe and how to create a practice that is low risk because you took the time to put a system in place. Now, it is important to understand that results will depend entirely on how you engage with the program and implement what you learn here. I can give you all the tools and information you need to improve your practice dramatically, but the future is up to you. So let me now reveal how to de-risk your practice by managing the security of your technology, how to stop the criminals. But first, let me tell you about what happens if you have a privacy breach, either cyber-related or just an oops moment. Now, a healthcare record can fetch up to $50 on the black market. This is compared to around $3 for a credit card. So you can see why criminals want to get to your data. If the average two-doctor practice has around 4,000 records, that's big money for the thieves. Now, they're hunting for personally identifiable information in the way of health records because with that, they can conduct prescription fraud, vanilla ID theft, or a rising trend, fraudulent care to someone else under your patient's name. Now, if your practice has a data breach, the Privacy Commissioner can fine you up to $1.8 million. From February 2018, new legislation is in place that enforces mandatory breach notification. All healthcare practices will be obliged to report any data or privacy breach to the Commissioner and also to AHPRA, and more importantly, also to the affected patients themselves. Now, this is going to open the Pandora's box of class action litigation. The average cost of reparation for a breach averages around $350 per record. So again, for the average practice with 4,000 records, that runs to a bit over $1.4 million. Normal practice insurances do not cover this sort of loss. So what would an unplanned cost of $1.4 million do to your practice? Would it potentially cause the loss of the business entirely? Could it lead to the loss of your house? Perhaps your family as well? There would certainly be a loss of reputation. Now, on average, over half of patients will leave your practice if you have a data breach. Could your practice survive this? So how do you reduce the risk to your practice of a cyber or privacy breach? Let me tell you now. You need to have written cyber and privacy policies and procedures in place. You need to test them, especially disaster recovery, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. They need to be part of your staff induction program, and also they need to be part of an ongoing staff training program. And as I mentioned before, you need solid contracts with third-party providers, especially IT providers, to ensure that everyone knows where they stand if there is a problem. Additionally, you should be looking to implement different access levels for employees who have access to personally identifiable information, or health records in your case. Meaning that your receptionist does not need access to clinical records. Now, most practice management solutions, or EMRs, will allow you to segment your users by their level of access, and that's something you should be doing. If someone leaves the practice, you need to immediately stop their access to any systems to avoid them accessing anything inappropriately. You should be using two-step verification processes, and we'll talk about that a bit later as well. If you're on paper records still, and most people wouldn't be, but if you are, you need to transition to an electronic system as soon as possible. And as you do that, shred any paper records that are no longer needed. And a fairly obvious one, prevent break-ins by implementing physical safeguards. That's deadlocks and alarms and bars on the windows, that type of thing. So in summary, the goal is to create a security culture. It's a state of mind. I'm sure you remember the hand-washing promotions a few years back. They were repetitive, boring, but now you probably don't even think for a second about washing your hands. You just do it automatically. Security needs to be the same. Now, if you're wondering how you can use this in your practice, here's how. The first thing you should do is run a complete risk assessment of the practice. Many practices use a variety of technologies, from faxes to kiosks to web portals. To make sure you're compliant, a risk assessment should be done with all your current systems to highlight areas where compliance is not enforced, and to expose any areas where changes are needed. Ensure the latest versions being used of any software, including or especially any security patches from the vendor. The risk assessment should be looking at your policies and procedures that are in place to manage access to personally identifiable information. Now, I know this sounds big and scary and expensive, but it doesn't have to be. Prepare for disaster before it occurs. All data handled by a practice needs to be safe from both loss and from corruption. One of the main ways of ensuring that data is not lost in case of any mishaps is backing up of data daily. Data should be backed up in an off-site location to ensure that in case of incidents such as a natural or man-made disaster, the data backup is not destroyed as well. You need to be running antivirus programs that are installed on all computers, including mobiles, and to ensure that your data is not corrupted or destroyed by viruses or held to ransom. We'll talk more about that later as well. Implement an ongoing employee training program. Now, any system is only as strong as its weakest link, as you know, and in some cases, it's poorly trained employees or temporary staff who are the entry point for hackers into a healthcare practice. It's also these staff who are more likely to have an oops moment and accidentally release confidential information. A practice may have excellent processes and systems, but if the employees aren't using their passwords to securely access records, the security is completely useless, and anyone can gain access to these records. Practices should be continually training their staff on how to follow the right security protocols to ensure data integrity and security. If you're buying new equipment, it needs to be compatible with your existing systems and offer a high level of security features. With the advent of connected devices, the so-called Internet of Things, it's critical that these devices are secure and kept up to date. Before making any major purchases, do a thorough review of the product from a security and compatibility point of view. This includes diagnostic devices, computers of all kinds, including mobiles, and even printers. And finally, collaborate with all affected parties. Now, changes which need to be made to bring about security and privacy compliance will affect pretty much everybody in the practice, but also your external providers. So affected groups need to be offered training, and management needs to ensure that staff understand the importance of compliance to everyone involved in the practice. Also ensure that your key staff are trained on what to do in the event of a breach. A comprehensive disaster plan is essential and needs to be practiced regularly. So let me now reveal how to de-risk your practice by planning and preparation. But first let me tell you an interesting story about a clinician who thought he had insurance for cyber events. Now recently I had a discussion with a medical doctor about privacy, security, insurance and a whole bunch of other things. For this exercise, let's call him Bob. Bob told me that he thought his insurance cover from his medical defence organisation, MDO, covered him for cyber liability. I suggested perhaps it was worth checking the fine print. Now the other day, Bob called me to say that he had checked with the MDO about cyber cover. Now after this discussion, I immediately thought of two songs that summed it up perfectly. Things That Make You Go Hmm by CNC Music Factory and How Bizarre by OMC. Now according to his insurer, Bob is covered for actual or alleged breaches of privacy or confidentiality. But there's always a but, isn't there? However, his policy excluded fines, such as those that could be imposed by the Privacy Commissioner. It excluded damages awarded by the courts, such as in a civil claim. It also excluded repayments to Medicare. It also had other exposures that were not covered, like the cost of forensic investigation. It's the cost of having an expert come in and understand what happened and how things went wrong. It didn't cover the cost of remediation costs, which we said can be up to $350 per patient. And it didn't cover the impact to the practice through interruption and loss of revenue. None of these things were covered by this policy. So what's the financial impact for Bob if his practice has a cyber event? He may have a regulatory fine imposed by the Privacy Commissioner of up to $1.8 million. He might quite possibly incur damages awarded by the Commissioner. And in recent cases, the Privacy Commissioner has awarded around $15,000 to each claimant in cases of a health data breach. Imagine how expensive that could be. You can do the maths, I'm sure. If you add in fines and damages, then the amount not insured would cost most people their business, their home, potentially much more. So what does Bob need to do? And what does he need to have covered? First thing he needs to consider is a specific cyber liability policy. And that needs to be tailored to his actual risk and his risk appetite. Now to do that, Bob first needs to understand his risk profile and financial exposure, including any potential vulnerabilities. Now, one of the things we've discovered in helping healthcare professionals along the way is that many healthcare practices have informal policies around cyber and privacy. Now, these are often just what we do, as opposed to being formally implemented in writing and in practice. A risk assessment will also help your practice with any future accreditation requirements, and if you have a breach, it will help to minimise the fallout because you actually took privacy seriously and proved it by addressing any vulnerabilities. Now, before you get offended, I know everyone really does take it seriously, but can you prove it to anyone? So as part of your business planning process, you need to identify all areas of risk and create a plan of how you're going to manage this. It should cover disaster recovery, loss of key staff, clinical misadventure, or illness on your part. Your risk universe is made up of three things. The first one is your appetite, the amount of risk that you're prepared to accept in pursuit of your goals as a business. The second thing is made up of is your risk tolerance, and that's the most risk and type of risk that the business can or will accept. And finally, your risk capacity, which is the level of risk the business can accept given your capital and equity position. For example, if your business is well cashed up, you may well have a larger tolerance. But if cash flow is tight and there's little in reserve, then your tolerance is likely to be minimal. Now, risk comes in many forms. It can be fire or burglary. It can be staff filing vexatious claims against the practice, or even well-founded claims. It may be your practice is in a flood zone. Or maybe just the fact that your business partner is a lot older than you could create risk. What if something happened to him or her? Would the practice continue without major impact? Do you have a solid agreement in place that clearly states how equity is dealt with if a partner dies? Now, in the chart on the screen that you can see that there needs to be a formal risk management framework, and that's managed by the partners and the practice manager. Now again, this looks very complex and time consuming, but it doesn't have to be. So once you've established your risks, you should then categorise them as to how likely they are to happen and match that to the severity of the impact to your practice. For example, if you're in a rural setting, the difficulty of getting staff may be a 5, and the impact is likely to be a 5 as well, giving the risk level an extreme rating, therefore red in the matrix. Now, a matrix like the one shown is a very simple way to visualise your risk profile. The next thing you need to think about doing is establishing policies and procedures and ensure that your staff are trained properly, and make sure that these policies are written down. Your staff may be very good at what they do, but does your practice have policies and procedures on how to handle a multitude of situations? Are they written down? Usually, everyone just gets on and does stuff, but policies do need to be written so you can point to them and say, we do enforce these. As important is the need to teach your staff about these policies and procedures. Do you have an induction program? Does your practice provide regular staff training to ensure that everyone knows the importance of specimen handling, for example, or the absolute necessity for patient information to be kept private? The next step is to review your insurances to make sure that you're appropriately insured, especially for any risk that is out of your control. Now, everyone hates to pay for insurance, but it's a fact of life that we need it. So you should regularly review your insurance coverage. Do you have adequate insurance for fire, flood, all those physical risks? How about key person insurance, income protection, cyber liability, as we talked about before? And my suggestion is to find a great broker who understands the healthcare market and work with them collaboratively to ensure that your risk appetite is married up with the appropriate cover. The last step is to review any specific standards applicable to your practice and ensure that you're compliant. Now, standards are a bit like insurance. We need them, but everyone hates the compliance part. And getting ready for accreditation can be a nightmare if you wait till a few weeks before the assessors are due. If you get the practice in order now and maintain a well-run business, the accreditation will in most cases look after itself. So as part of your business planning regimen, you should be reviewing the appropriate accreditations to which you need to be accountable, and making subtle changes along the way as you work. As those standards evolve, it's going to be a much more pleasant experience than trying to do a major catch-up every couple of years. Now, here's how you can apply this in your situation. When you understand your risk, you can sensibly manage it, and that means that you'll be able to sleep at night. Also, you'll have the confidence that your practice has taken every possible precaution to have the highest levels of security. You'll be comfortable in the knowledge that your insurance cover is appropriate, and if the worst case scenario happens, you'll be able to carry on. Now, the first step is, do you have a business plan? If not, then how do you know where you're going? How will you know when you get there? As someone famous once said, fail to plan, plan to fail. So as I said, you do need to have a business plan. Yes, there's some time to put it together, but it doesn't have to be war and peace. A couple of pages to clearly articulate where you want your business to go, how you'll manage challenges such as risk is all you need. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out process, nor expensive. There are hundreds of coaches out there who can guide you through the process, or Google has thousands of free templates. Either way, you do need a plan. Now in this plan, you need to identify the risks that face your business. There's things like physical risk, fire, flood, cyclones. There's people risk, staff or intruders. Did you know that over half of privacy breaches are caused by staff? There's patient harm. The more busy you are, the more stressed and worried about running things, the less time you have to spend with your patients. Rushed consultations equals less care, leading to a higher probability of harm. Technology, a server failure, a long-term power outage. What happens if that server that lives under the bench in the staff kitchen gets someone's lunch spilt all over it? It's useful to have a list of all the possible risks facing your business, from fire to fraud, from staff to servers. So once you've identified the risks in the business, we can proactively manage them. The first step is to decide your risk appetite and tolerance. If you have a couple of $1 million sitting in the bank, well, first, you probably don't need to be here. But if you did, you may well say, okay, I can self-insure for some of this stuff. It's more likely you don't have that sort of disposable cash, so you will need to decide, either individually or with your partners in the business, just how much is okay. That will be a decision that only you can come to, but you do need to consider it. Wherever possible, eliminate the risk. One simple way to remove a potential risk is to run your practice management solution in the cloud, so backups and accessibility is guaranteed, as opposed to that server in the lunchroom that could wear someone's cup of soup. This means that a possible major risk is no longer a worry and you can move on to the next one. Again, where possible, eliminate things that produce undue risk. Now, some things are not able to be eliminated, obviously, but some can. If your location is flood prone, is it an option to relocate? A flood would be devastating in terms of the cost to replace equipment and fittings and even structures, but perhaps you can accept the risk of a 1 in 100 year flood. Make sure that you have strong contracts for all external contractors, as well as for any internal staff who are on contract. You get the picture. And finally, you need to insure for that uncontrollable risk. So when you've decided what you can and must live with, you need to insure for that risk. A good broker can help you through this process, and as I said before, use a broker who understands healthcare. Now, all of these things will help you come up with a disaster recovery plan, and you do need one of these. It's no good turning up the morning after your server crashed or the building burnt down and wondering, what do we do now? Building a contingency plan is critical. Again, it may sound daunting, but with the right help, it doesn't have to be. And finally, as promised, let me give you 10 practices that you can set up in your clinic today. Before I teach you about this, let me tell you about one of the worst data breaches in history. Now, horror stories abound in the world of cyber attacks and privacy breaches, but let me tell you about one particularly scary story. As I said, one of the worst data breaches in history, and it was in healthcare. In May 2017, a global ransomware attack known as WannaCry affected more than 200,000 computers in at least 100 countries. In the UK, the most affected was the National Health System, the NHS. The attack affected 81 of the 236 NHS trusts, and 595 GP practices were also infected. The scary thing is that the Department of Health was warned about the risk of cyber attacks the year before, but did not take action. Almost as bad is that the department had no idea if the trusts were even prepared for an attack. They also issued specific warnings in April 2017 about the WannaCry ransomware. The NHS Digital Agency had conducted 88 on-site security assessments and none had passed. Now, it's estimated that 19,000 appointments were cancelled, including surgeries, and this number doesn't include GP appointments not met or ambulances being diverted. So what were the lessons learned? All of the organisations infected by WannaCry shared the same vulnerability and could have taken relatively simple actions to protect themselves. These organisations had unpatched or unsupported Windows operating systems. Now, if they'd used and managed firewalls, they would have also been protected against this infection. One of the key findings from the investigation afterwards was that the organisations, their boards and staff must take the cyber threat seriously. Another finding was that there needs to be a response plan, what to do if things go pear-shaped. Perhaps one of the most disturbing findings was that over 1,200 pieces of diagnostic equipment were also infected. So the important lesson for all practices, large or small, is that you need to take this seriously and manage your IT proactively. You also need to ensure that your staff are trained on what to do in the event of an attack. It is important to note that none of the NHS trusts paid the ransom, and nor should you, if you find yourself on the end of a ransom attack. Now, let's look at the 5 practices you should consider right now. Practice number 1 is to use strong passwords and change them regularly. Passwords are the first line of defence in preventing unauthorised access to any computer. Regardless of the type or operating system, a password has to be required to log in and do any work. Although a strong password won't prevent attackers from trying to gain access, it can slow them down and in some cases discourage all but the most determined. Additionally, strong passwords combined with effective access controls that we mentioned earlier help to prevent casual misuse. For example, staff members pursuing their personal curiosity about a case, even though they have no legitimate need for that information. You should also consider strong or multi-factor authentication, which combines multiple different authentication methods, resulting in stronger security. In addition to a username and password, another method is used. While a password and username is something you know, multi-factor authentication also includes something you have, like a smart card or a key fob, or something that is part of who you are, such as a fingerprint or a scan of your iris. Practice number 2 is to install and maintain antivirus software. The primary way that attackers compromise computers in a small office is through viruses and similar code that exploits vulnerabilities on the machine. Now, these vulnerabilities are ubiquitous due to the nature of the computing environment. Even a computer that has all of the latest security updates to its operating system and applications may still be at risk because of previously undetected flaws. Additionally, computers can become infected by seemingly innocent outside sources such as CDs, emails, flash drives, and web downloads. So therefore, it's important to use a product that provides continuously updated protection against these exploits. Now, antivirus software is widely available, it's well tested to be reliable, and costs relatively little. Practice number 3, use a firewall. So unless your practice uses an electronic medical record system that is totally disconnected from the internet, you need to have a firewall to protect against intrusions and threats from outside sources. While antivirus software will help you find and destroy malicious software that is already entered, the firewall's job is to prevent it coming in the first place. In short, the antivirus can be thought of as infection control, while the firewall has the role of disease prevention. A firewall can be either software or hardware, and in either case its job is to inspect all messages coming into the system from the outside, and then determine whether that message should be allowed in. Practice number 4 is to plan for the unexpected. Now, sooner or later, the unexpected will happen. Fire, flood, cyclone, earthquake, and other natural or man-made disasters can strike at any time. Important healthcare records and other vital assets need to be protected against loss from these events. There are 2 key parts of this practice. The first one is creating backups and having a sound recovery plan. In the world of business, creating a backup is routine. In the small practice, however, it's possible that staff are only used to the home computing environment, where backups are rarely considered unless a crash happens, by which time it's far too late. From the first day a new electronic medical record system is functioning in a practice, the data needs to be backed up regularly and reliably. A reliable backup is one that can be counted on in an emergency, so it needs to be tested. So it needs to be captured correctly, and it needs to be able to be accurately and quickly restored. As I said, backup media needs to be tested for the ability to actually restore properly. It doesn't matter what medium is used to hold the backup data, it has to be stored safely, so it can't be wiped out by the same disaster that befalls the main system. Now, depending on local geography or type of risk, this could mean that backups should be stored many miles away. Now, one option for backup storage is cloud, which may be a viable option for many since it involves no hardware investment and little technical expertise. However, cloud backup needs to be selected with care. The backed up data has to be as secure as the original and must be stored according to the various federal and state regulatory requirements. Now, usually this means the cloud provider has to be located in Australia, and as we talked about earlier, recovery planning must be done so that when an emergency occurs, there is a clear procedure in place. In a disaster, it's possible that practices will need to supply medical records and information rapidly, so the practice has to be prepared to access their backups and restore functionality, which requires knowledge about where those backups are stored, how they were prepared, and what equipment's needed to read them. Now, if possible, this information needs to be placed for safekeeping at a remote location where someone has responsibility for producing it in the event of an emergency. The fifth and final practice is to protect your mobile devices as well. Now, mobile devices, laptops, handheld smartphones, portable storage media, etc. have opened the world of opportunities to untether electronic medical records from the desktop. But these opportunities also present threats to information security and privacy. Some of these threats overlap with the desktop world, but others are quite unique to mobile devices. Because of their very mobility, these devices are easy to lose, and because they might be used in areas accessible to the public, they're also very vulnerable to theft. So mobile devices are more likely than stationary ones to be exposed to electromagnetic interference as well, especially from things like MRI machines. This interference can corrupt the data that's stored on the mobile device. Now, because mobile devices might be used in places where it can be seen by others, extra care has to be taken by the user to prevent unauthorized viewing of the data displayed on the laptop or handheld. Not all mobile devices are equipped with strong authentication and access controls, so extra steps may be necessary to secure the mobile device from unauthorized use. Laptops need to have password protection that conforms with what we talked about in Practice 1, and many handheld devices can also be configured with password protection, and this should be enabled whenever it's available. Where it's not available, additional steps need to be taken to protect the personally identifiable information on the handheld, including extra precaution of the physical control of the device. Now, laptops and handhelds are often used to transmit and receive data wirelessly. Now, these communications must be protected from intrusion. Personal information transmitted unencrypted across a public network can be done where the patient requests it and has been informed of the potential risks. Generally, however, personal information should not be transmitted without encryption across these public networks. Finally, transporting data with mobile devices is inherently risky. There must be an overriding justification for this practice that rises above mere convenience. So how does this apply to you? Let me show you. Security practices need to be built in, not bolted on. Now, no checklist can adequately describe all that needs to be done to establish an organisation's security culture, but there are some obvious steps that can be taken, and these include education and training, which needs to be frequent and ongoing. Those who manage and direct the work of others need to set a good example and resist the temptation to indulge in exceptionalism. Accountability and taking responsibility for information safety has to be among the organisation's core values. Protecting your patients through good data security practice needs to be a second nature as much as it is with disinfection. Now, if you'd like a free set of checklists for these 5 and some others practices, wait until the end, which is not long now, and I'll show you how to get a copy. That's if you didn't download it already before the session. Now, at the outset, I said I would teach you 3 things today. The first was to show you how you can minimise the risk of someone stealing your patient records. The second thing was to show you how to reduce your risk by introducing planning into the practice. And finally, I promised to provide you with 5 simple practices that you can implement today to protect your practice and your livelihood. So how did I do? So what's a real opportunity for you in your practice? Here's how I see it. You can minimise your risk of a cyber or privacy breach. By making some changes and actively running your practice as a business, you can significantly reduce the risk of a privacy breach that could cost you millions of dollars. You can have a clear picture of your risk universe and be able to manage that, which leads to peace of mind, not to mention better mental health. And by reducing your risk, you can be more profitable, meaning an exit at your pace. And many practices are getting bought up by corporates. If you have a well-run business, you'll optimise your return. With the corporatisation of healthcare practices going on, a well-managed, profitable practice will attract a premium price, should you choose to sell. The corporates are likely to want to see your risk management processes as part of their due diligence. Now, even if you're thinking about a merger with another practice to avoid the corporate takeover, this should be part of your due diligence on the other practice. Now, the good news is it's not about whether you have the complete ability to do this right now today. It is about whether you can take a step now and learn the rest as you go, with some help along the way. So what you need to win in this business we call healthcare is that you need the right plan, and you need the right systems, and you need the right help. So at this point you have a choice to make. You can click away and forget everything I've just told you. But it also means that nothing changes, and you may become a Dr. Bill. But if you really want to treat security and privacy seriously, then here's how I can help. Now, I told you I'd give you a gift at the end, and yes, we are just about at the end. The big difference between Dr. Bill and Dr. Harry is that Harry actively took a decision to make sure he understood his risk. Now, I've set aside some time in the next 48 hours to speak to 15 people only about how you can apply these ideas to your practice starting today. Whatever your biggest problem is regarding security, privacy, or planning, I can help you solve it. On a 45-minute security consultation, I'll help you in 3 ways. First, I'll talk to you about your biggest challenge in security, privacy, or planning. Secondly, I will help you solve it. And the third thing I'll do is I'll set out a step-by-step plan as to how you can significantly reduce your risk of losing everything because of a breach. I'll also show you how to look at your practice as a business. Now, just as a reminder who this is for, it's for practice owners who understand that without the right strategy, you're only ever 30 seconds away from disaster. You're looking for a simpler way to put some basic security in place. You want to learn how to avoid huge penalties if you have a privacy breach. Or if you simply want to be able to sleep at night, knowing that you really are a Dr. Harry and not a Dr. Bill. Now, if you can say yes to all of this, then I'm happy to help you for free during a 45-minute security consultation. Why do I do this? Well, if we make a connection, and you're absolutely positive that I can help you achieve your goals, then you may want to apply to work with me. Now, if it's a win-win for both of us, that's fantastic. If not, then that's no issue at all. So we have a 48-hour window available only for 15 people. Click on the button you see below and you'll be taken to my online calendar where you can make a time that suits you for me to give you a call and discuss these 3 things. So on that 45-minute security consultation, I'll help you by talking to you about your biggest challenge in security, privacy, or planning. I'll help you solve that problem. And I'll also set out a step-by-step plan as to how you can significantly reduce your risk of losing everything you've worked for in your practice. And I'll also help you look at how you can run your practice as a business. Now, if you'd like that free checklist for the 5 practices, simply email me at the contacts below, mention checklist in the subject line, or you can visit the website shown for a free download. So click on the button now, decide to make a positive change, and I look forward to chatting with you very soon. Thanks again for being part of this session.